Imagine a world where every message you send, every search you make is secretly monitored. One man exposed it all, risking everything to show the truth. Was it courage or betrayal? Let's dive into the files that shook the world. Welcome, friends, to a story that stretches across continents, governments, and the invisible corridors of power. Wherever you're watching from, drop your city and the time in the comments. I love seeing how this story connects people around the world. Tonight, we're stepping into a hidden world of surveillance, encrypted networks, and secret programs that monitor what we do online. And at the center is a man whose choices would expose it all, sparking a global debate on privacy, trust, and ethics. Imagine your life under constant observation. Every message, every search, every call, monitored. What would you do if you discovered the truth? Would you stay silent or risk everything to reveal it? Do you think such acts are courage, patriotism, or betrayal? Share your thoughts below. This journey isn't just about technology. It's about human courage, moral choices, and the tension between secrecy and transparency. From Hong Kong to asylum negotiations, from encrypted files to global shockwaves, we'll follow Snowden through a world most of us can only imagine, feeling every quiet step, every whispered decision, every ripple of consequence. So, settle in, listen closely, and let yourself be drawn into the rhythm of the story. And now, let's step into Chapter 1, Shadows Behind the Screen, where the files spoke, the world shifted, and one man's choice changed everything. Rain tapped lightly against the window pane, each drop a metronome in a world that hardly noticed its own rhythms. Somewhere deep in Fort Meade, the hum of servers persisted, a low, unceasing heartbeat behind steel walls and keycard-protected doors. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors, soft, deliberate, each step a whisper of secrets that no one outside would ever understand. Edward Snowden sat alone in a dimly lit office, the glow of monitors casting pale blue light over his face, reflecting eyes that had begun to see too much. Outside, the city slept, unaware that inside this quiet fortress, a man was beginning to notice a pattern, a pulse, a reach of unseen tendrils that stretched into every digital corner of the world. The hum was familiar, almost comforting, if it weren't for the knowledge it carried. Thousands of servers cataloging billions of communications, every click, every email, every conversation. A system so vast, so meticulous, that it seemed to breathe. And yet, the very breath of this machine whispered questions. Questions Snowden could not unhear. Who watches the watchers? And what happens when the watchers themselves are watched by no one but the abstract logic of machines? He remembered his early days, a boy fascinated by computers, by the elegance of code, by the thrill of breaking boundaries without breaking laws. That curiosity had carried him from the small streets of Elizabeth, New Jersey, to the ranks of one of the most secretive organizations on the planet. He had been proud once, proud to serve a nation he believed in, proud to contribute to security in an uncertain post-9/11 world. Yet now, in the dim glow of surveillance logs and internal memos, pride was a fragile thing, fragile as glass over a city at night. Each login screen was a doorway. Each classified document was a heartbeat. Snowden had learned to navigate these corridors with care, to listen as much as he typed, to note the almost imperceptible tremor in a system when certain data streams were accessed. Metadata tells a story, a colleague had said once, almost in passing, and it echoed now, louder than intended. Metadata was everything, but it was also nothing until someone learned how to read it. And Snowden, despite his youth, had begun to read it differently. He saw the patterns, the silent echoes of a program called PRISM, an architecture of digital omniscience that reached further than even he could have imagined. It was not merely a matter of numbers. He saw families' emails, businessmen's encrypted files, conversations between lovers that were never meant to be cataloged. The system was precise, merciless, and indifferent to morality. Footsteps outside the office reminded him that he was still within a fortress built on human diligence and institutional trust, but he had begun to question the foundation itself. Who decided which communications mattered, which data was cataloged, and which ignored? The questions were dangerous, yet impossible to silence. He moved quietly across the room, fingers brushing the cool metal of filing cabinets, the rustle of paper punctuating the quiet. Every memo, every spreadsheet, every internal audit was a thread in a tapestry of power. And the tapestry was not just American. It stretched across alliances, across borders, across oceans, a network of information so vast that it could not possibly be controlled by a single mind. But someone had to see it. Someone had to understand it. That person, Snowden realized, was staring back at him from the reflection in the monitor. The first subtle alarm came in the form of an internal memo flagged as routine, a request to monitor certain foreign communications. But the breadth of the request caught him off guard. Names, locations, email addresses, IP addresses. The system was tapping into private lives, aggregating, storing, analyzing. Every keystroke, every attachment, every fleeting thought transmitted digitally was being traced. And while the logic of security was clear to his supervisors, the human consequences were invisible to them. Footsteps passed outside once more, softer now, a door sliding open and closed down the hallway. No one noticed him noticing. Weeks turned into months. Snowden watched the data grow, observed algorithms tracing entire populations, building a digital mirror of the world. It was a reflection of everything, yet filtered through the lens of secrecy. The more he saw, the more a quiet tension built inside him, a small, persistent echo of unease that became impossible to ignore. He began to take note, to archive, to memorize patterns that others treated as routine. Each time a system administrator boasted about perfect compliance, he felt a chill. Because perfect compliance meant nothing if it ensnared lives that had no choice in the matter. He remembered conversations in briefing rooms, hushed tones exchanged over coffee, the soft clatter of keyboards as contractors whispered about programs they were sworn never to speak of. Trust existed in these spaces, but it was fragile, layered with deception. Snowden had learned the art of careful observation, the tilt of a head, a nervous glance, a pause in the rhythm of typing. He could read fear, anticipation, and occasionally guilt. These were the human traces that the machines could never capture, and yet they were the most telling of all. At night, in the small apartment he rented near the base, he would lie awake, listening to the distant traffic, imagining the invisible threads connecting him to every corner of the globe. Servers in Utah, data centers in Virginia, fiber optic lines beneath oceans, all feeding into a machine designed to know. And knowing was power. He understood that deeply. Yet, with that understanding came a responsibility he had not yet named, a moral weight that pressed against his chest. One evening, a flagged document appeared in his secure terminal. PRISM, it said simply, Program for Data Extraction, Active. He had heard the name whispered once or twice in passing, almost mythic, almost unreal. Now it sat before him, a concrete, undeniable proof of the reach and scale he had begun to sense. The diagrams and slides showed connections to tech giants, emails siphoned directly from servers, calls traced with alarming precision. Footsteps in the hall outside his office faded into silence. The world outside had no idea what this machine could see, and yet he held the first pieces of its map in his hands. Snowden's pulse quickened. Every rule he had learned, every layer of security, suddenly felt like a boundary he had to navigate, not just technically, but morally. He understood that knowledge itself could be dangerous, and he also knew, instinctively, that there were others in the building who would act swiftly if they sensed his awareness. The tension became physical, pressing against him in the quiet hum of the room. Each breath measured, each glance over the shoulder, a habit born of instinct. He closed his eyes briefly, the glow of the monitor painting a faint light on the walls, and imagined what it would mean if these documents reached the public. A shiver ran down his spine, a mixture of fear and certainty. Footsteps approached, softer, deliberate, almost casual. A colleague passed, eyes forward, unaware that Snowden had begun to map a path that would redefine secrecy itself. He returned to the documents, scrolling, memorizing, imagining the implications, every line a thread connecting him to the lives he would one day expose. The hum of the servers grew louder in his consciousness, a low, omnipresent rhythm echoing in the silence. Each data point was a heartbeat, each connection a whisper. Snowden realized that he was standing at the edge of a precipice, the kind of precipice where one step could alter history. He had a choice: to remain a silent observer, to trust the system that had trained him, or to act on the unease that had grown inside him, quiet at first, then insistent, impossible to ignore. And in that moment, as the rain continued its steady cadence against the window, the first real question formed fully in his mind. How far would he go to tell the world what it did not yet know? The door behind him clicked faintly. Footsteps receded down the hall, and in the echoing silence, Snowden knew the game had changed. Nothing would ever be the same. And the program that had whispered its secrets into his consciousness was waiting for him to decide whether to remain its silent witness, or to become its reckoner. The first thread had been pulled, and in the stillness of Fort Meade, with servers humming and secrets unfolding, a quiet storm began to stir. Cliffhanger transition. Weeks later, Snowden would find himself at a moral crossroads, a choice between loyalty and conscience, as PRISM's full scope pressed upon him. Every secret would demand exposure, and every step toward disclosure would draw him closer to danger, to betrayal, and to a world that was not ready for the truth. The air was thick with the sterile scent of electronics and paper. Keyboards clicked rhythmically, a soft chorus of productivity masking the undercurrent of vigilance that ran through every office in the intelligence complex. Snowden moved quietly along the narrow aisles of cubicles, aware that each glance could reveal more than it seemed. In this world, silence was as potent as speech, observation more revealing than disclosure. He had grown adept at noticing the subtlest shifts in posture, the almost imperceptible hesitation in someone's gaze. It was in these small human fractures that the machinery of surveillance met the vulnerability of those who maintained it. From the outside, Snowden might have appeared as any other contractor, a faceless employee in a massive government apparatus. But inside, he carried a growing awareness that he was standing on the threshold of something extraordinary and extraordinarily dangerous. Each day brought him closer to truths few dared to acknowledge. He had access to secrets that could reshape global understanding, yet each revelation carried a weight almost unbearable. The data flowed past him like an endless river, servers humming, fiber optic cables thrumming with electric life, each packet a tiny fragment of human thought and behavior. His early career had been shaped by ambition and curiosity, a thirst for knowledge that had driven him from his childhood home in Elizabeth, New Jersey, into the shadowed corridors of Fort Meade and the CIA's classified systems. Snowden had been fascinated by encryption, by the elegance of code and the promise of understanding the invisible architecture of the digital world. He had believed in the system once, trusted that those in power wielded it judiciously, that the vast machinery of surveillance existed to protect rather than control. And yet, as he delved deeper into PRISM and the constellation of programs surrounding it, he began to sense a dissonance between intent and execution, between principle and practice. Late nights became a habit. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead mixed with the low buzz of servers, forming a steady, hypnotic rhythm that made hours slip by unnoticed. Snowden would sit alone, reviewing logs, scrutinizing flagged communications, following threads of data that seemed insignificant to most, but revealed patterns to him. Each sequence told a story. Metadata was no longer just numbers. It was a narrative, a map of human interactions spanning the globe. Footsteps in the corridor outside reminded him that he was not alone, yet the anonymity of his colleagues allowed him a unique vantage point. They spoke in hushed tones, referenced programs in passing, but few understood the true scope of what they managed. Snowden did. He began to notice irregularities. Requests for monitoring, flagged as routine by supervisors, were anything but routine. The scale and breadth of surveillance expanded constantly, reaching into private lives without apparent oversight. Emails, phone calls, video conferences, all captured, analyzed, stored. And yet, the protocols for handling such data were opaque, inconsistently enforced, leaving Snowden with a gnawing sense of unease. The tools he had been trained to use for security had become instruments of pervasive observation. Snowden's dilemma was not merely technical, it was moral. Every day, he navigated a complex web of loyalty and conscience. To whom did he owe his fidelity? To his employer, whose directives were binding yet morally ambiguous. To his country, whose ideals he had long believed in, but whose institutions now seemed to operate without transparent ethical guidance. Or to the millions of individuals whose private lives were cataloged in the silent hum of servers, whose voices were absorbed into an algorithmic echo chamber without consent or awareness. He remembered conversations with colleagues, moments when security officers spoke of national interest in abstract terms, as though the concept itself could justify intrusion into lives untouched by politics or power. Snowden's own reflections were quieter, internalized, threading through his thoughts like a persistent whisper. The tools themselves were not evil, but the way they were wielded, the hidden reach, the lack of oversight, posed profound questions. Questions that no training manual addressed, questions that no supervisor seemed willing to confront. Every choice Snowden made carried consequences. Every line of code he accessed, every flagged file he reviewed, edged him closer to knowledge that could not be ignored. He began to archive, to note patterns, to understand the architecture of control he had once admired with technical fascination alone. Each discovery brought with it a tension that tightened in his chest, a subtle pressure that made even mundane tasks feel urgent. The hum of servers became a metronome of anxiety, the flashing cursor on his screen a pulse that synchronized with his own racing heartbeat. There were moments when fear crept close, when he imagined the consequences of discovery. Whispers in hallways, the slight tilt of an eye, the soft shuffle of papers, each became a reminder that someone, somewhere, was always watching, and that even in a room full of allies, trust was fragile. Snowden's awareness of surveillance was no longer merely professional, it was existential. He understood that knowledge was power, but also a burden that could isolate him completely. The moral tension became acute as he observed the mechanics of PRISM in operation. It was a program of extraordinary reach, able to pull digital threads from technology companies across the globe, aggregating information into a centralized repository. Emails were siphoned, calls traced, data archived, all with a precision that would have astonished the engineers who designed the networks themselves. And yet, the human element, oversight, ethical judgment, consent, was almost entirely absent. Snowden began to see the patterns, the subtle ways that authority had extended into privacy, the invisible lines that blurred the distinction between security and intrusion. Footsteps echoed outside his office one night, soft, casual, yet they reverberated in the quiet with disproportionate significance. The hum of the servers continued, indifferent to human anxiety. He glanced at the glowing monitor, watching streams of metadata and encrypted files scroll past, each line a potential revelation, each connection a story untold. He understood with growing clarity that he was at a moral crossroads. Remaining silent meant complicity. Acting meant risk, exposure, perhaps exile, and certainly the ire of those who believed in absolute secrecy. In the quiet hours, Snowden reflected on his family, on the life he had left behind, on the ideals that had guided him to this point. The technical mastery he possessed was now entwined with ethical responsibility. Each decision weighted with profound consequence. The choices ahead would define not only his own trajectory, but potentially the course of global understanding of privacy and security. He felt the isolation keenly, a solitary figure in the glow of a monitor, contemplating the reach of a machine capable of watching everything yet blind to conscience. Weeks passed in a rhythm of observation and contemplation. Snowden became increasingly meticulous, documenting irregularities, cross-referencing logs, memorizing patterns that others considered routine. The tension was constant, but subtle, like a quiet storm gathering on the horizon. He could no longer view the systems as neutral tools. He saw them as instruments that reflected the ambitions, fears, and ethical lapses of the people who commanded them. Each interaction, each memo, each flagged request became part of an intricate map of influence, control, and moral compromise. One evening, a classified brief arrived detailing new expansions of PRISM, including partnerships with major technology firms and international surveillance nodes. The language was clinical, neutral, almost bureaucratic in its presentation, yet the implications were staggering. Snowden read line after line, absorbing the enormity of the program, feeling the weight of knowledge press against him. His pulse quickened, not from excitement alone, but from the gravity of responsibility. The hum of the servers seemed louder now, a resonant echo of the human consequences embedded in the machine's logic. He knew that to act, or to even fully grasp the full implications, he would have to navigate a dangerous path, one that risked career, freedom, and perhaps life itself. Each decision became a careful calculation, each movement measured, each thought deliberate. The corridors of the intelligence complex felt simultaneously familiar and alien, every face a potential observer, every conversation a potential test of loyalty. The moral calculus was relentless, impossible to resolve in a single moment, yet impossible to ignore. And yet, amid the tension, Snowden felt a subtle, insistent clarity forming. Knowledge was not neutral, power was not abstract, silence was not protection. The awareness that he could see what others could not, that he could understand the program in ways beyond his colleagues' comprehension, carried with it a weight impossible to ignore. He realized that the choices he would make in the coming weeks would define the trajectory of his life, and perhaps the understanding of surveillance itself for generations to come. Footsteps receded into the distance. The hum of the servers continued, steady, persistent, as if urging him toward a decision that had no easy resolution. Snowden closed his eyes briefly, letting the ambient rhythm of electronics and paper guide his thoughts. The crossroad lay before him: remain a silent observer within a system he increasingly distrusted, or confront the moral imperative that had begun to assert itself with insistent urgency. And in that quiet, electrically charged room, he knew the first irreversible step would be taken soon. The moral dilemma was no longer theoretical. It had become tangible, almost corporeal, pressing against him with every heartbeat. He understood that once he acted, the machinery of secrecy would react. Allies could become adversaries, friends could betray, and trust would fracture. But knowledge, once truly understood, demanded acknowledgement. The document flagged PRISM on his screen, the list of programs and data access points glowing faintly in the dim office light. Snowden's fingers hovered over the keyboard, not yet typing, yet fully aware that the act of observation had already transformed into the act of choice. The tension in his chest mirrored the low, steady hum of the servers, a rhythm marking the silent countdown toward the moment when curiosity would collide with conscience. In the shadows of Fort Meade, amid the whisper of papers and the occasional shuffle of footsteps, Edward Snowden faced a decision that would shape history. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with danger, and lined with questions that no algorithm could answer. And as the rain tapped again against the distant windows, he knew that the days ahead would test not only his skill, but the very essence of his moral courage. Cliffhanger transition. The weeks that followed would push Snowden from internal contemplation to the precipice of action. Every observation, every archived file, and every choice would build toward the moment when he could no longer remain silent, and when the quiet corridors of Fort Meade would become the stage for one of the most consequential revelations in modern history. The contractor's dilemma was about to become a confrontation with destiny itself. The room was bathed in the sterile, pale glow of monitors, each screen a window into lives that were not his own. The quiet whirring of fans mingled with the distant hum of servers, creating a constant, low-frequency drone that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Edward Snowden leaned closer, the light casting shadows that traced every line of tension across his face. PRISM. The word itself was deceptively simple, almost innocuous, yet it held within it the reach of a machine that could see into the private corners of a digital world. He had encountered programs before, systems designed to analyze, sort, and flag, but this was different. The diagrams scrolled across his screen, elegant in their design, terrifying in their implication. Lines connected servers, tech companies, international nodes, each a conduit for data, each a potential prism of intrusion. Email metadata, voice calls, video streams, all captured, analyzed, stored, cataloged. And while the logic of the system was precise, the consequences were human and devastatingly intimate. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. He did not look up. The hum of the servers was louder than the distant shuffle of shoes. It was a rhythm he trusted more than the walls themselves. He remembered his training, the repeated admonitions to trust in the system, to follow protocol, to never let curiosity override procedure. Yet, the human mind has a persistence that no protocol can contain. Snowden's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he cross-referenced documents, tracing pathways of data collection that even his supervisors had not fully comprehended. The reach was global. Governments, corporations, private citizens, even families tucked into their homes, all became data points, moving through invisible corridors without knowledge, without consent. It was in that quiet calculation, that meticulous attention to detail, that the scale of PRISM revealed itself fully. The program was designed for efficiency, a network capable of cataloging millions of communications each day, analyzing patterns, constructing predictive models, and feeding intelligence to analysts with astonishing speed. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a tool, but Snowden understood its true power, a machine that could read the world without ever being read itself. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, and let the implications wash over him. Each line of code, each flagged document, each server log represented a choice made in invisible rooms by people who would never be seen or questioned. And the consequences of those choices were unfolding silently, invisibly, in lives far beyond Fort Meade. Footsteps again, closer this time, punctuated by the occasional click of a keycard or the soft rustle of paper. Snowden's pulse tightened, a familiar rhythm now linked with awareness, caution, and an almost sacred sense of responsibility. Weeks of observation, cross-referencing, and quiet contemplation had brought him to this moment. He understood PRISM not merely as a program, but as a network of trust, secrecy, and moral compromise. Each connection traced in the diagrams was a choice, each node a decision to prioritize security over privacy, efficiency over ethics. And yet, there were layers even he could not penetrate. The opacity of certain protocols, the hidden encryptions, the compartmentalization designed to prevent exactly this kind of insight, all these were obstacles, but they were also a challenge that called to the very core of his analytical mind. He remembered a colleague's offhand comment, "Metadata tells a story." At the time, it had seemed almost trite, a catchphrase tossed between technical teams. Now, as he traced the pathways of information, Snowden realized the profundity of those words. Metadata was not merely a record, it was a narrative, a map of interactions, a reflection of human behavior seen through the lens of digital infrastructure. And in that narrative, he saw both order and chaos, power and vulnerability, the terrifying symmetry of a system designed to see all, yet accountable to none. Every document he reviewed was a potential revelation. Emails between corporate executives, private messages between lovers, communications between dissidents in distant countries, all flowed into PRISM, cataloged and analyzed without consent. He could trace connections, anticipate patterns, see the echoes of human decisions that would otherwise have gone unnoticed. And yet, the deeper he delved, the more he recognized the moral complexity. The architects of PRISM believed in their mission, in security, in the prevention of threats. But belief did not absolve consequence. Snowden's conscience pressed against him like a physical force. He had entered this world as a contractor, a cog in a machine he did not fully question. But knowledge is a mirror, and once reflected, it cannot be unseen. The line between observation and responsibility blurred with every slide he opened, every server log he traced. He began to archive files, not for personal gain, but to preserve a record, to understand the full scope of what had been unleashed. The sound of his fingers typing softly across the keyboard was a subtle rhythm, almost a heartbeat, blending with the mechanical hum around him. There were nights when he lay awake, listening to the distant city through the small vents of his apartment. The world outside seemed calm, oblivious to the digital eyes now sweeping across its communications. And yet, the quiet of night contrasted sharply with the storm that had begun to form within him. PRISM was a prism not just of data, but of morality, power, and consequence. It was a mirror reflecting choices, ethics, and the potential for harm hidden beneath the guise of security. Each day brought new challenges, new nodes, new protocols, new access points. The system evolved faster than most could comprehend, adapting, expanding, integrating new data streams, yet always with an air of inevitability. Snowden's role was clear: observe, understand, and maintain operational integrity. Yet the moral calculus had shifted. Every action, even every choice to remain silent, now carried weight beyond the immediate. The hum of servers became a metronome of conscience, each beep and pulse a reminder that observation was no longer neutral. He began to consider the human cost. Families monitored without knowledge, individuals whose communications were cataloged and analyzed, entire populations subject to unseen scrutiny. He thought of whistleblowers past and present, of the courage required to confront secrecy, of the isolation inherent in knowing what others do not. Footsteps echoed softly in the hall, almost musical in their cadence, yet each step was a reminder that the system itself was a presence, patient, persistent, omnipresent. Weeks passed, and Snowden's preparation became meticulous. Every document he accessed, every internal slide he studied, every note he took was a careful step along a path fraught with danger. He knew that exposure could bring professional ruin, legal jeopardy, even exile. But he also recognized that ignorance was not an option. The narrative of PRISM, if left untold, would continue to shape global understanding of privacy, surveillance, and power without challenge or oversight. He imagined the day when these files would speak to the public. The thought was at once exhilarating and terrifying. He pictured the headlines, the outcry, the debates that would rage in parliaments, corporations, and living rooms around the world. And he felt, with clarity, that this narrative, once revealed, would have no reverse. Once the files spoke, the conversation about surveillance, privacy, and ethical responsibility would never be the same. Snowden's hands hovered over the keyboard. He could feel the weight of decision, of inevitability pressing against him. He had become more than a contractor. He was now a witness, a guardian of knowledge that demanded attention, understanding, and perhaps revelation. The faint click of a keycard outside his office reminded him that time and opportunity were fragile. The hum of servers and the soft rustle of paper filled the silence, as he made a quiet vow to continue, to understand fully, to prepare for the moment when silence would no longer suffice. And in that quiet, electrically charged room, Edward Snowden began to map the consequences of his choice, tracing every path, weighing every risk, and feeling the first stirrings of a resolve that would carry him far beyond the corridors of Fort Meade, into exile, into controversy, and into history. The prison was no longer a program. It was a mirror, reflecting his own conscience back at him, insisting that observation alone was no longer enough. Cliffhanger transition. The months ahead would force Snowden from study into action, from observation into confrontation. Every careful calculation, every secret traced in digital corridors, would soon demand a decision. And when he finally acted, the world would be watching, and nothing could remain hidden. The Hong Kong night was humid, thick with the scent of exhaust and rain-washed streets, a pulsing labyrinth of neon and shadow that seemed to mirror the turbulence inside Edward Snowden's mind. Every step along the narrow sidewalks echoed with careful deliberation, soft taps of shoes against concrete masking the anxiety that pressed against his chest like a vice. The city was alive, indifferent to the storm gathering within a single man, a storm built from months of observation, moral calculation, and the relentless hum of servers far across the Pacific. He moved through alleyways and back streets, a thin backpack slung over one shoulder, his identity protected by layers of careful deception. Each street lamp cast long shadows that flickered over his face as if testing his resolve. Snowden had traveled this path not for adventure, not for thrill, but for survival and for revelation. He understood that to release what he knew would be to alter the trajectory of history, and yet survival itself had become a precarious negotiation, a dance between visibility and invisibility, between courage and the natural human instinct to hide. The airport was a nexus of both hope and peril. Each boarding pass, each passport check, each line of sight from customs officers and security personnel carried with it the potential for exposure. Snowden had prepared meticulously, studying the routes, memorizing the flows of airport traffic, anticipating scrutiny down to the smallest detail. His heart beat in rhythm with the distant announcements overhead, mechanical and yet somehow personal, echoing the tension in his chest. Every glance over a shoulder, every soft murmur of a voice behind him, was magnified by the knowledge that once he left, there would be no turning back. He remembered the meetings with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, their cautious coordination, whispered conversations over encrypted channels, the soft clicks of keyboards and the low hum of laptops in small, dimly lit rooms. Trust was scarce, precious, and fraught with danger. One misstep, one unencrypted communication, one casual mention could undo everything. The journalists were his lifeline, conduits through which the files he carried could reach the public without interception. And yet, even as he relied on their expertise, he could feel the weight of responsibility pressing against him, a tangible force heavier than any physical burden he had ever carried. Snowden's nights were punctuated by preparation, reviewing encrypted documents, checking communications protocols, ensuring that every file, every slide, every note was accounted for. He mapped escape routes mentally, rehearsed contingencies silently in the empty spaces of his apartment, and imagined every scenario from the mundane to the catastrophic. The hum of electronics accompanied him, steady, familiar, a backdrop to the storm of uncertainty that surrounded him. Footsteps outside his door were now more than background noise. They were potential threats, indicators that the web of observation he sought to expose could also ensnare him. The moment of departure arrived under the unremarkable guise of a business trip. Snowden moved through customs with quiet efficiency, the lines of officers and cameras forming a lattice of potential exposure. He felt eyes on him in ways both seen and unseen, the nervous awareness of a man who understood the full reach of modern surveillance. The documents he carried were both shield and vulnerability, a paradox of power and peril. Every step toward the boarding gate was a negotiation between secrecy and the inevitability of revelation. Once on the plane, the hum of engines joined the familiar hum of servers in his consciousness. Snowden's mind raced even as his body sat still. He reflected on the months that had brought him here, on the meticulous observation, the sleepless nights, the moral calculations, the sense of impending obligation that had grown in intensity until it became impossible to ignore. Each breath was a measured act of patience, each glance at the encrypted laptop beside him a silent acknowledgement that his life, and perhaps the understanding of modern surveillance, would change irrevocably in the coming hours. Arrival in Hong Kong was both relief and tension. The city offered anonymity, but also unpredictability. Every interaction, every taxi ride, every hotel corridor could be scrutinized. He moved quietly, guided by the soft murmurs of contacts who had prepared safe spaces, secure lines, and encrypted pathways. The city became both shield and labyrinth, each alley and neon-lit street a reminder of the delicate balance between freedom and vulnerability. The smells of street food, the chatter of locals, the distant sirens, all coalesced into a symphony of normalcy that belied the extraordinary nature of his purpose. Within days, Snowden met with Greenwald and Poitras. Their collaboration was careful, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Documents were transferred through encrypted drives. Conversations were conducted through channels that might have seemed paranoid to outsiders, but were lifelines to him. The files themselves were staggering, a testament to both technical ingenuity and the expansive reach of PRISM. Emails, chats, calls, all flowing into centralized servers, archived, analyzed, and categorized with a precision that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Footsteps echoed outside the room where they met, the rustle of paper and tap of keyboards a quiet accompaniment to conversations about global consequences, ethics, and exposure. Snowden's hand hovered over encrypted storage devices as he listened to the journalists outline potential approaches. Every option carried risk. Each decision could trigger alarms in ways he might never detect. The quiet tension in the room was palpable, the kind that pressed against the chest, a soft but insistent reminder that every choice was consequential. His resolve hardened. He was no longer merely an observer. He was now a participant in a chain of events that would ripple across continents, institutions, and millions of lives. The first publications were planned with care, each article a carefully constructed narrative to reveal PRISM while minimizing personal exposure. Snowden's role was simultaneously critical and invisible. He provided knowledge without inserting himself into the story unnecessarily, yet his presence was the linchpin of the operation. Every keystroke, every line of text prepared for journalists, every encrypted communication was part of a choreography that required precision, trust, and moral courage. Days blurred into nights. The Hong Kong skyline shimmered through rain-soaked windows, a city alive yet indifferent to the drama unfolding in its quieter corners. Snowden would often sit alone after meetings, absorbing the enormity of the information he had carried, the risks he had navigated, and the stakes that had grown immeasurably. The hum of electricity, the faint tapping of rain, and the distant sounds of the city became a meditative rhythm, almost sleep-friendly in their consistency, yet underscored by the knowledge that revelation was imminent. He began to understand the duality of his existence. He was both protected and exposed, free and captive, empowered and vulnerable. Each contact, each encrypted line, each secure transfer was a thread in a fragile web connecting him to the outside world and to the consequences that would soon unfold. The moral urgency that had propelled him from the corridors of Fort Meade now demanded physical presence, active coordination, and unrelenting attention. And then the first article went live. A ripple ran through global newsrooms, social media, and intelligence communities alike. The PRISM slides, carefully de-identified but devastatingly revealing, spoke of an unprecedented reach into private lives. Governments reacted in shock, Corporations responded defensively, and the public, finally aware of the digital surveillance enveloping their communications, gasped collectively in disbelief. Snowden watched, a quiet figure in a Hong Kong apartment, as the first tremors of consequence spread outward, invisible waves shaking the world he had once only observed. Even in this moment of impact, the tension did not ease. The hum of servers, the rustle of papers, the faint footsteps outside, every sensory cue reminded him that exposure was only beginning. The stakes had escalated, from ethical concern to global confrontation, from moral dilemma to active revelation. Footsteps in the hallways of the intelligence community, distant yet palpable, hinted at pursuit, investigation, and reprisal. Snowden's life had become a theater of shadows, each decision a scene with irrevocable consequences. Night after night, he reviewed slides, logs, and communications. The scale of PRISM's intrusion was clearer than ever. Entire populations were now data points, movements traceable, behaviors analyzable, all without consent. And yet, despite the gravity, he felt a quiet sense of inevitability. Once knowledge was known, it demanded acknowledgement. The world had the right to understand the breadth of surveillance it had unknowingly consented to, even indirectly. Footsteps outside the apartment were a constant reminder that he was not immune. The global machinery of intelligence was mobilized, and yet he remained, moving through encrypted channels, maintaining protocols, navigating Hong Kong like a shadow in the neon-lit streets. He was both present and absent, visible and invisible, a man defined by the knowledge he carried rather than the streets he walked. Weeks passed in a rhythm of revelation and caution. Each new article, each disclosed slide, each public response intensified the scrutiny. Snowden's role became paradoxically larger and smaller. He was the architect of revelation, yet remained unseen, the trigger of global conversation, yet physically isolated. The hum of servers, the quiet rustle of paper, the soft ambient noise of the city, all formed a lullaby of tension, a sleep-friendly cadence masking the extraordinary stakes of his every action. And in the quiet hours, as Hong Kong slept and the world awakened to truths previously concealed, Edward Snowden contemplated the next steps, the broader implications, and the unavoidable reality. Exposure was irreversible, pursuit was inevitable, and the digital mirror he had uncovered would now reflect not just surveillance, but human courage, fear, and consequence. Cliffhanger transition. The world had been warned, yet Snowden's flight was far from over. The next chapters would carry him from the relative anonymity of Hong Kong into a confrontation with global powers, a manhunt that stretched across continents, and a life lived at the edge of visibility. Every revelation would be a risk, every decision a potential trap, and every step forward a choice between freedom and capture. If you discovered a secret that could change the world, would you stay silent or risk everything to reveal it? Comment your choice and your city below. Let's see how people around the world feel about whistleblowers. The morning broke over Hong Kong like a muted drumbeat, a city alive with light and motion, unaware that its streets now bore silent witness to a revelation poised to reverberate across the globe. Edward Snowden sat in a small, dimly lit apartment, the glow of his laptop painting his face in cold, blue light, a ghostly reflection of the storm he had unleashed. Outside, rain glimmered against neon signage, reflecting the fractured brilliance of the city, shimmering and chaotic, like the data he had revealed. The hum of servers in his consciousness persisted, a steady, low-frequency reminder that information once freed was unstoppable, inevitable, unstoppable in its cascade. At precisely the moment the first headlines appeared online, a quiet, almost imperceptible tension gripped him. Each click of a key, each scroll of a news feed, each murmur of social media chatter was a heartbeat in the collective consciousness suddenly awakened to a world they had never fully understood. PRISM was no longer a theoretical concern, a bureaucratic abstraction tucked into the obscurity of classified programs. It had been named, described, traced, and exposed. And in that exposure, The weight of his actions pressed against him like the static hum of electricity through wire and screen. The files spoke in numbers, charts, and diagrams, yet their language was unmistakably human. Metadata became narrative, patterns revealed intentions, and communications, once private, silent, and assumed invisible, now emerged like shadows cast into harsh light. Entire communication networks traced, call records flagged, video streams archived, the infrastructure of global surveillance laid bare, precise, surgical, and almost horrifying in its completeness. And yet, as the world absorbed the data, Snowden felt the first stirrings of vindication, mingled with the relentless awareness of exposure. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. The machinery he had revealed would respond, and it would respond with the speed, reach, and intensity of a system designed to protect itself above all else. In the streets of Hong Kong, life continued, indifferent to the quiet tremor rippling through global intelligence communities. The scent of street food, the chatter of vendors, the rhythmic clatter of vehicles over wet pavement, all seemed oblivious to the tectonic shift now underway. Yet, Snowden knew that the invisible web of observers had already mobilized. Analysts at Fort Meade, spurred into frantic review, traced digital breadcrumbs, scanned networks, assessed risk. Every encrypted channel, every secure transfer, every seemingly innocuous blog post was being scrutinized for hints, patterns, and leads. Footsteps outside his apartment occasionally reminded him that he was no longer merely an observer. He was now the observed. The first media reactions were cautious, polite, almost analytical. Journalists dissected PRISM slides, debated ethics, and speculated about scale and scope. Governments responded with official statements of denial, reassurance, and misdirection. Yet, beneath the surface, the seismic shifts had begun. Intelligence officers traced lines of inquiry, algorithms recalculated risk, and private communications flagged anomalies, all in response to a single man's decision to illuminate what had been hidden. Snowden sat silently, absorbing the gravity of what he had set into motion. The apartment felt simultaneously safe and perilous, a cocoon against a storm that had already begun to break outside its walls. He thought about the millions of ordinary lives now implicated in a system they had never consented to. Emails, phone calls, search histories, all cataloged, stored, analyzed. The human element, once abstract, now pressed against him with undeniable reality. Each document he had released carried with it echoes of consequence, unintended yet inevitable. Footsteps in hallways, faint electronic traces, the soft rustle of encrypted drives, each was a whisper in a network he had both relied upon and revealed. Snowden reflected on the moral weight of his decision. The act of exposure had transformed him from observer to catalyst, from contractor to historical figure in a drama whose dimensions stretched far beyond the cramped apartment he inhabited. The files themselves were neutral, silent, obedient to logic and sequence, yet the impact was profoundly human. Debate ignited across continents. Parliaments convened emergency meetings. Corporate executives scrambled to manage the optics. And amidst it all, ordinary citizens grappled with the realization that the digital lives they had taken for granted were anything but private. He watched online forums, media outlets, and encrypted discussion boards, tracing the waves of reaction as they spread outward. The sheer scale was dizzying. Social networks flooded with commentary, international headlines exploded with analysis, and legal experts began parsing implications for constitutional law, privacy rights, and international agreements. Each ripple confirmed what he had long suspected: the world was unprepared for the reach and precision of modern surveillance. And yet, each ripple also carried the validation of necessity, the confirmation that disclosure, though dangerous, was essential. In the quiet, he allowed himself brief reflection, remembering the days at Fort Meade when the programs were abstract, when logs and alerts were only lines of code, when decisions were theoretical rather than irrevocable. Now, every line of PRISM he had traced, every pattern he had observed, resonated with consequence. Footsteps outside, faint but persistent, reminded him that no action existed in a vacuum. The storm of information he had released would provoke not just ethical debate, but political, social, and personal consequences for years to come. Snowden's resolve strengthened. Each keystroke, each encrypted communication, each carefully coordinated disclosure was deliberate, a step along a path that demanded precision, judgment, and courage. He became increasingly aware of the global scale of attention focused on him, not as a human being, but as the embodiment of revelation. The world now saw PRISM not as a distant abstraction, but as a pervasive instrument capable of observing, recording, and influencing without notice. And in that reflection, he saw the consequences of secrecy, control, and the subtle human compromises that had allowed the system to grow unchecked. The reactions were swift and intense. U.S. government officials condemned the disclosures, citing national security and the imperatives of counterterrorism. Allies expressed concern, journalists analyzed the legal and ethical ramifications, and social media buzzed with debate over privacy, freedom, and the rights of the individual versus the state. The files had spoken, but the dialogue they initiated was only beginning. Each document Snowden had released became a touchstone, a flashpoint in conversations that spanned continents and cultures. Even as the world reacted, Snowden remained methodical. Every action, every communication, every decision was weighed against the twin imperatives of safety and impact. He moved through encrypted channels, carefully managing exposure, aware that the machinery of surveillance he had revealed was now turning toward him. The hum of servers, the distant sounds of Hong Kong streets, the faint rustle of papers in nearby rooms, all were reminders that observation was both everywhere and invisible, that risk had become constant, and that his life was intertwined with the very system he had exposed. And then, the personal stakes became immediate. Whispers of investigation reached his ears, subtle but unmistakable. Surveillance of communications, unannounced inquiries, reports that someone of interest had been noted in Hong Kong. The pursuit was real, unrelenting, and close enough to shape each choice he made. He felt the shadow of consequence, not as a vague threat, but as a persistent presence, threading through every street he walked, every interaction he undertook, every plan he enacted. Even in the isolation of his apartment, the rhythm of the world pressed against him. The hum of electricity and electronics became a steady meditation, a sleep-friendly cadence against the backdrop of global chaos. Footsteps outside, the distant wail of sirens, and the murmur of streets below merged into a soundtrack of tension, awareness, and inevitability. He was both participant and observer, catalyst and witness, orchestrating a revelation that had already begun to reshape the contours of modern life. As the day unfolded, Snowden traced the consequences in real time. News outlets across Europe and the Americas reported, governments convened emergency briefings, and corporations began reviewing internal compliance. Every public reaction, every media narrative, every digital footprint confirmed the reach and resonance of the disclosures. The files spoke with clarity, precision, and force, yet their true impact was not in the numbers, charts, or slides. It was in human consciousness, in the awareness that privacy, once assumed, could be violated with unprecedented efficiency. Snowden allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The storm was no longer theoretical. It had arrived, tangible, immediate, and far-reaching. Each click of the keyboard, each review of documents, each encrypted communication was part of an ongoing choreography, a delicate balance between exposure and impact, visibility and concealment. And through it all, the underlying moral imperative, the belief that the world deserved knowledge of the systems operating in secret, remained unshakable. Cliffhanger transition. The global consequences of PRISM's exposure were only beginning. Edward Snowden's flight, both literal and ethical, would soon intersect with political machinations, international pressure, and personal risk at a scale he could scarcely anticipate. Every revelation would intensify the manhunt, every choice would carry immediate danger, and every action would force him to confront the complex interplay of morality, legality, and survival. The files had spoken, but the story of their impact had only just begun. The quiet of Hong Kong had shifted. Rain-soaked streets that once offered relative anonymity now felt like an open stage, where every movement could be observed, every sound interpreted, every step tracked. Edward Snowden moved deliberately through the city, a shadow among shadows, a man who had become simultaneously invisible and impossibly conspicuous. His senses had sharpened to the smallest anomalies: a uniformed officer lingering too long at a street corner, a taxi making an unusual detour, a flicker of a camera lens reflecting his presence. Every detail mattered. Every sound, scent, and movement was a potential warning. Footsteps echoed beneath him in stairwells and alleyways, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close. The world beyond the city had begun to react with urgency that had no precedent. PRISM's exposure was more than a scandal. It was a declaration of vulnerability to the global systems of power. Governments activated rapid response teams. Intelligence analysts scanned every network, and legal apparatuses began interpreting treaties and domestic laws under extraordinary pressure. Snowden's image, once an abstraction, was now a focal point of obsession. Media speculation, government denials, and social media frenzy coalesced into a continuous storm of attention that threatened to overwhelm even his carefully planned defenses. Within Hong Kong, Snowden's movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. Safe houses provided temporary reprieve, each room equipped with encryption devices, secure servers, and contingency plans. Yet, no shelter was absolute. He maintained constant vigilance, rehearsing exit strategies, memorizing street layouts, and mentally preparing for the moment when physical pursuit would intersect with digital exposure. Each night, as he lay beneath dim lighting, the city hummed around him, a lullaby of tension, the faint, distant echo of sirens, the occasional clatter of late-night traffic, a soundscape that was both calming and alarming, sleep-friendly, yet imbued with peril. The human element proved as challenging as the technical. Snowden's contacts, journalists, activists, and legal advisors, were essential, yet limited in availability. Every meeting was measured, conducted through encrypted channels, coordinated to minimize exposure while maximizing the impact of the disclosures. He understood the precariousness of trust. Even a single misstep, a lapse in vigilance, or a misjudgment of intent could compromise the delicate network supporting him. And the forces aligned against him were formidable: professional intelligence officers, surveillance specialists, and international security services, all trained to detect anomalies, exploit weaknesses, and track patterns that might otherwise seem inconsequential. Snowden's nights were filled with a rhythm of preparation, observation, and anticipation. He analyzed the first wave of media coverage, noting inaccuracies, speculations, and the selective focus of narratives. He calculated the potential consequences of every headline, every public interpretation, every government statement. The files he had released were precise, technical, and complete, yet the world's understanding of them would be mediated through perception, rhetoric, and reaction. He needed to anticipate not only the mechanics of pursuit, but the politics of interpretation, the strategies of deflection, and the timing of disclosure. Footsteps, distant but present, reminded him that physical danger was immediate. Shadowing operatives, tailing vehicles, monitoring communications. These were not abstract threats. They were orchestrated, deliberate, and precise. Snowden adapted, moving with a fluidity that disguised his routine, blending into cafes, libraries, and narrow streets, leveraging the textures and rhythms of the city to create layers of invisibility. The ordinary urban noise, the chatter of pedestrians, the click of high heels, the roar of engines, was a veil through which he passed unnoticed, even as every networked device in the city might be cataloging his presence. International pressure escalated with unprecedented speed. The The U.S. government issued formal requests for extradition, liaised with foreign intelligence agencies, and activated rapid response protocols designed to track, locate, and capture him. Allies debated the legitimacy of his disclosures, some framing him as a whistleblower, others as a traitor. Analysts dissected PRISM's slides, retracing digital pathways, attempting to reconstruct his movements through metadata, while diplomats negotiated the intricate, often invisible tensions that emerged from a single individual exposing state secrets. Snowden's days were consumed with countermeasures. Secure devices were updated, communications meticulously encrypted, and movements timed to avoid predictable patterns. He became hyper-aware of the sensory environment, the angle of streetlights casting shadows on his face, the rhythmic pattern of footsteps echoing in corridors, the occasional flicker of reflective surfaces that might reveal his image. Every detail, however trivial it might have seemed before, was now part of a broader calculus of survival and strategy. The global media spotlight intensified. Every interview, leaked statement, and news report was analyzed for consistency, for intent, for the potential to trigger both public debate and official retaliation. Snowden recognized that his personal exposure was inseparable from the impact of the information he had released. He had become both messenger and message, a human node through which the digital revelations gained life, agency, and consequence. The hum of servers and the rustle of papers were ever-present companions in this narrative, a soft auditory backdrop to the relentless intellectual and emotional pressure he navigated. He considered the moral and psychological dimensions of the hunt. Surveillance was no longer theoretical. It had become immediate, a palpable pressure that demanded constant calculation. He weighed every choice against the potential consequences: movement, communication, disclosure, concealment. The balance of risk and responsibility became a rhythm in itself, a quiet internal pulse that guided him through moments of apparent calm. Every decision carried the weight of potential impact on both his own life and the lives of those implicated in the revelations. Snowden's strategic thinking extended beyond immediate survival. He began mapping potential routes out of Hong Kong, considering jurisdictions, diplomatic relationships, and airport networks. The objective was not merely to avoid capture, but to continue enabling the files to speak, to maintain the flow of information that would reshape global understanding of surveillance practices. The intelligence network pursuing him was formidable, but it was also predictable, bound by protocol and geography. His awareness, creativity, and meticulous preparation became his most vital assets. Days turned into a blur of cautious movement, observation, and encrypted communication. Every new report, every leak analysis, every response by governments and corporations shaped the evolving narrative. Snowden observed patterns, identified pressure points, and anticipated actions before they were executed. Yet, for all the planning, the uncertainty remained, a constant companion. Footsteps outside a safe house, an unplanned interaction on a city street, the unpredictable behavior of intermediaries, all reminded him that survival was never guaranteed, that every decision was fraught with risk, and that consequence was always close at hand. The psychological toll was profound. Isolation, constant vigilance, and the burden of global consequence weighed heavily. Moments of quiet reflection were punctuated by awareness that the forces arrayed against him were vast, interconnected, and relentless. He developed mental routines, sleep-friendly rhythms, and observational habits that allowed him to maintain cognitive clarity while navigating the extraordinary pressures of exposure and pursuit. The hum of electronics, the ambient sounds of the city, the subtle tactile cues of his environment became a sensory map, guiding him through both strategy and survival. Snowden's interactions with journalists and legal advisors were now operationally critical. Every meeting was encrypted, every word calculated, every gesture deliberate. The success of the disclosures depended on precision, trust, and timing. The slightest error could compromise both safety and impact. The files themselves, while powerful, required careful narrative framing, contextualization, and strategic release. Snowden understood that knowledge without careful deployment could be both dangerous and ineffective. Meanwhile, the hunt intensified globally. Intelligence analysts coordinated across borders, leveraging satellite surveillance, network forensics, and human intelligence. Every airport, border crossing, and transit hub became a potential trap. Diplomatic pressure mounted. Countries weighed alliances, treaties, and public opinion. The sheer scale of coordination and urgency underscored the extraordinary nature of Snowden's flight. He was no longer a single individual acting quietly. He had become the epicenter of a global operation, a moving target at the intersection of law, politics, and technology. And yet, amidst the constant tension, Snowden maintained focus. The files had spoken, and he remained committed to ensuring they were heard. Each movement, each encryption, each cautious interaction was a deliberate act of agency, a choice to navigate danger while amplifying the impact of revelation. The rain-slicked streets of Hong Kong, the hum of servers, the soft rustle of papers, all became part of a rhythm, a meditation, a sleep-friendly cadence that masked the extraordinary stakes of his existence. Cliffhanger transition. As the manhunt escalated, the next steps would take Snowden beyond Hong Kong, across borders, and into a geopolitical storm. Every decision would carry global consequences, every movement would be tracked and analyzed, and the pursuit, both legal and clandestine, would intensify. The world had heard the files speak, but now the individual behind them would face the full force of the systems he had exposed. The wheels of the airplane hummed beneath him, a low, mechanical heartbeat that echoed through the cabin and through Edward Snowden's consciousness. He stared out the window into the night sky, a blanket of clouds muted by city lights and distant stars, the boundaries of Earth and atmosphere blurring like the uncertainty that had become his existence. Each mile he traveled carried him further from Hong Kong, yet paradoxically closer to the gravitational pull of global attention, the invisible magnetism of governments and intelligence agencies that had begun to orbit around his every move. The flight was more than transportation. It was a liminal space, a suspended reality where time and consequence intertwined. The hum of engines, the rhythmic tapping of flight attendants' shoes, and the faint whirring of cabin ventilation created a sensory cocoon that was both sleep-friendly and tension-laden. Snowden's mind, however, refused the luxury of rest. Maps, networks, contingency plans, and potential asylum destinations rotated silently, inexorably in the theater of his mind. Every alternative carried both hope and hazard, and every decision was a potential pivot point in a chain reaction that could stretch across continents. As the aircraft descended over Moscow, the city below gleamed like a grid of fire and ice, an intricate lattice of light and shadow, a metropolis breathing under the cold weight of political scrutiny. Snowden's gaze shifted between digital readouts and street maps, mentally rehearsing the sequence of interactions that would define the next chapter of his existence. He was entering not merely a physical space, but a geopolitical stage where diplomacy, legality, and clandestine maneuvering intersected. The airport would not merely be a point of arrival, it would be a theater of observation, negotiation, and survival. The Russian airspace was dense with radar and surveillance, an invisible lattice constantly monitoring the skies. Snowden's presence within this controlled environment was a paradox. He was both a traveler and a target, an individual navigating the mechanisms of global geopolitics while evading the extraordinary reach of an intelligence apparatus that had been trained to anticipate his every move. The psychological strain was potent. Each announcement over the intercom, every murmur of cabin crew, every subtle vibration in the fuselage became cues, stimuli that informed strategy, reinforced caution, and maintained hyper-awareness. Upon landing, the terminal felt simultaneously protective and precarious. Local authorities moved with a deliberate, bureaucratic rhythm, while the subtle hum of cameras, scanners, and automated sensors created an omnipresent atmosphere of observation. Snowden moved with a careful choreography, blending into patterns of other passengers, masking intent with the mundane gestures of a traveler. Footsteps echoed in marble halls, rolling suitcases rattled over polished floors, and the distant murmur of conversation created a symphony of ordinary noise, a sensory veil under which extraordinary tension unfolded. The next days became a study in exile as much as survival. Every interaction was mediated through intermediaries, legal counsel, diplomatic contacts, and journalists operating under strict protocols. Decisions were layered, overlapping, and temporally compressed. A single misstep could compromise safety, international agreements, or the very dissemination of the files that had defined his existence. Each conversation, each encrypted message, each carefully structured meeting was part of an intricate choreography designed to maintain autonomy in the face of overwhelming external pressure. Media coverage escalated with unprecedented velocity. The world now had faces to associate with the previously abstract concept of surveillance. Headlines alternated between valorization and condemnation, casting Snowden as both hero and traitor, whistleblower and fugitive. Social media exploded with analysis, memes, political debate, and speculation, a digital storm powered by real-time information and the human appetite for narrative. Snowden observed this with a detached awareness, noting patterns of public attention, shifts in perception, and the cadence of emerging discourse, all while remaining physically constrained and meticulously strategic. Exile brought with it profound isolation. Even as he moved through safe houses, embassy corridors, and temporary accommodations, Snowden experienced the unique psychological weight of being simultaneously hyper-visible and intensely private. Cameras, satellites, and digital monitoring systems created a persistent backdrop of scrutiny, while the absence of familiar faces and the constraints on mobility produced a deep, almost meditative solitude. The hum of electronics, the subtle tap of keyboards, and the distant city noise became a steady rhythm, a sleep-friendly cadence that contrasted with the cognitive and emotional turbulence of his predicament. Within this tension, Snowden maintained operational precision. Encrypted communications were conducted with meticulous care, safe houses rotated on an unpredictable schedule, and contingencies for international movement were recalculated continuously. The interplay between legal risk, diplomatic negotiation, and clandestine maneuvering became a daily calculus. Every movement, every interaction, and every technological engagement carried potential consequence: exposure, capture, or both. Footsteps outside rooms, distant voices in corridors, and the faint mechanical hum of surveillance systems all reminded him that exile was never a sanctuary, only a temporary theater of survival. The geopolitical stakes intensified as diplomatic channels engaged. Governments debated asylum, extradition, and the public ramifications of harboring a figure who had disrupted traditional paradigms of surveillance and secrecy. Media attention became a proxy battlefield. Op-eds, interviews, and leaked documents informed and inflamed public opinion. The files themselves, meticulously organized and de-identified, now functioned as both shield and provocation, carrying the moral authority of transparency while simultaneously escalating risk. Snowden's physical location became secondary to the global attention he commanded. He moved carefully through Moscow, aware that every terminal, street, and building was potentially surveilled. Taxi rides, hotel corridors, and pedestrian thoroughfares were navigated with choreographed precision, a delicate balance between maintaining cover and asserting presence. The rhythm of the city, footsteps echoing on asphalt, distant conversations, the soft hiss of metro trains, became a sensory map through which he calibrated movement, timing, and exposure. Every action was deliberate, every pause calculated, and every observation recorded mentally for future strategic decisions. Journalists remained critical nodes in his strategy. Each encrypted conversation, secure meeting, and coordinated release reinforced the narrative while ensuring that the files continued to speak. Their reporting amplified the revelations, contextualized the technical data, and mediated public perception. Snowden's guidance was subtle, almost invisible, but indispensable. He had become simultaneously a participant in and orchestrator of a global discourse, a human node through which ethical, political, and technological dimensions converged. As the days unfolded, the psychological pressure intensified. Isolation, constant vigilance, and the omnipresent sense of pursuit created a continuous cognitive load. Snowden developed routines that combined meditation, observation, and calculated rest, balancing the demands of strategy with the physiological and psychological need for recovery. The hum of electronics, distant city noise, and ambient environmental sounds became part of a sleep-friendly meditation, a rhythmic backdrop to sustained vigilance. Footsteps in corridors, the distant whir of cameras, and subtle changes in ambient noise reinforced awareness while providing a structured auditory environment. Every move in Exile carried both opportunity and risk. Interactions with diplomats, journalists, and legal advisors were executed with care. Communications with global newsrooms were timed and encrypted to maximize dissemination while minimizing vulnerability. Snowden's mental map of risk, exposure, and consequence was continuously updated, a dynamic three-dimensional structure in which every variable was considered, anticipated, and strategically navigated. The files continued to reverberate globally. Governments reassessed surveillance programs, corporations evaluated compliance, and ordinary citizens reconsidered digital habits. Each reaction was both data and consequence, a feedback loop that confirmed the effectiveness of disclosure while simultaneously increasing the personal stakes for the individual behind the revelations. Snowden's exile was thus both protective and precarious, a means of survival, yet a continuous exercise in managing impact and perception. Cliffhanger transition? Exile was no longer merely physical, it had become psychological, political, and moral. The global pursuit of Snowden would escalate, intertwining international law, diplomacy, and clandestine maneuvering in ways that threatened to redefine both his existence and the discourse on privacy. The next chapter would confront the intensification of this pursuit, the pressure of political negotiations, and the personal consequences of living in perpetual liminality. The sterile hum of embassy corridors became Edward Snowden's new rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat syncing with the tension that gripped his every move. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors, echoing the meticulous order that contrasted starkly with the chaos of the global storm outside. He navigated these spaces with practiced caution, every step measured, every gesture calculated. The world had shifted since Hong Kong. PRISM's exposure had triggered ripples that reached across continents, and now the hunt had transformed into a calculated geopolitical chess game. Every nation, every diplomat, every intelligence officer was a potential player. Every conversation could carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Snowden's negotiations for asylum were delicate, intricate, and fraught with unseen dangers. Each communication with legal advisors was encrypted, every movement through embassies and safe houses meticulously timed, yet he was acutely aware that the forces pursuing him were equally sophisticated, equally patient, and relentless in their determination. The press followed, global governments debated, and citizens everywhere grappled with the implications of the revelations. Each day, the stakes intensified. Each interaction became a potential trigger point, a critical node in the complex lattice of diplomacy, legality, and personal survival. Inside the embassy, time seemed suspended. The faint hum of air conditioning, the rustle of papers, the subtle clicking of keyboards, all formed a sensory backdrop to hours of silent negotiation. Snowden's mind operated on multiple planes, assessing the political posture of each nation, anticipating the implications of public statements, evaluating media coverage, and calculating contingency plans. He was both actor and observer, participant and strategist, enmeshed in a process where every word could be interpreted, manipulated, or weaponized. Footsteps in hallways, distant murmurs of voices, and the occasional metallic clink of doors reinforced the invisible pressure of observation. The diplomatic landscape was treacherous. Countries weighed the consequences of granting asylum against international law, political alliances, and public perception. Each negotiation was a delicate balancing act, a nod to legality, a tacit acknowledgement of ethical responsibility, and a careful navigation of the optics for global audiences. Snowden's legal team operated in tandem with journalists, strategically releasing information to maintain pressure and public awareness without jeopardizing immediate safety. Each briefing, each press release, and each public statement was part of a choreographed sequence designed to amplify impact while controlling risk. Within this web of strategy, Snowden found moments of acute isolation. Safe rooms provided temporary refuge, yet each lock, each encrypted device, each carefully monitored entrance was a reminder that true freedom was contingent, fragile, and elusive. The hum of electronics, the rhythmic ticking of distant clocks, and the faint echo of footsteps outside formed a cadence both sleep-friendly and anxiety-laden, reinforcing awareness while providing a structured sensory environment in which he could maintain focus and operational clarity. Media coverage became both ally and adversary. Every article, broadcast segment, and social media post contributed to the pressure on governments, shaping public perception and influencing political decisions. Headlines alternated between praise and condemnation, highlighting ethical courage on one hand and alleged betrayal on the other. Snowden's role was simultaneously invisible and omnipresent. He orchestrated the narrative without directly appearing in it, yet every development reflected the strategic precision of his initial disclosures. Legal maneuvers took on unprecedented importance. Extradition requests, international treaties, and the fine print of asylum law became instruments in a high-stakes contest. Snowden's team navigated complex channels, engaging legal experts in multiple jurisdictions, analyzing precedent, and identifying loopholes that could protect him while enabling the continued dissemination of information. The interplay between law, ethics, and personal survival was relentless, each layer of negotiation adding complexity and tension to the already high-stakes environment. Snowden's personal life became defined by hyper-awareness. Every step outside, every communication, every interaction carried weight. Surveillance could come from human agents, automated monitoring systems, or digital tracking. Each minor anomaly, a phone call, a vehicle parked nearby, a reflection in a window, was scrutinized and evaluated for threat potential. Footsteps in corridors, the distant hum of metro trains, and the rustle of papers became integral sensory cues, part of a mental mapping system that allowed him to navigate the dual realities of public attention and private risk. As the asylum process progressed, the stakes escalated internationally. Governments engaged in closed-door diplomacy, leveraging alliances, treaties, and geopolitical considerations. Leaks and counter-leaks emerged, each designed to sway public opinion or exert pressure. The files themselves, still the catalyst for global attention, became both weapon and shield, a tangible manifestation of transparency, with implications that could influence policy, law, and international relations. Snowden understood that his role was not merely personal survival, but also the orchestration of a global dialogue, each action calibrated to maintain both impact and security. The psychological burden of exile weighed heavily. Sleep was fragmented by constant vigilance. Meals were consumed with awareness of potential observation. Every mundane task was reframed as part of a strategic calculus. Yet, amidst the pressure, a methodical rhythm developed. The hum of electronics, the faint, distant sounds of the city, the subtle tactile cues of environment became a structured background against which critical thinking, observation, and tactical decision-making unfolded. Footsteps in the hallways of embassies and safe houses became a constant measure of awareness, a reminder that every step, literal and metaphorical, had consequences. Snowden's interactions with journalists continued to define the strategic dimension of his asylum. Coordinated releases ensured the files spoke continuously, each new revelation reinforcing public awareness and maintaining pressure on governments. These releases required meticulous planning, including timing, narrative framing, and the careful calibration of risk. Each encrypted conversation, each secure meeting, was a maneuver in a larger, ongoing campaign that merged ethical commitment with operational necessity. The international hunt intensified. Intelligence agencies tracked movements, analyzed communications, and coordinated globally. Every airport, transit hub, and potential point of entry or exit became a nexus of scrutiny. Snowden's movements were carefully choreographed to avoid patterns, minimize exposure, and maintain access to critical communication channels. The complexity of survival increased with every diplomatic maneuver, every media story, and every legal filing. Exile was both shield and trap, a precarious equilibrium between safety and ongoing engagement. Amidst these pressures, the files continued to resonate globally. Governments reviewed surveillance programs, corporations assessed compliance measures, and ordinary citizens grappled with privacy implications. Each response was data, each reaction both consequence and instrument. The files had become living entities, catalyzing debate, influencing policy, and challenging assumptions about the intersection of technology, law, and ethics. Snowden, as their steward, managed the balance between revelation and security, influence and vulnerability. Footsteps outside safe houses, distant murmurs, and subtle changes in ambient noise were constant reminders of the stakes. Every decision carried weight. To move, to communicate, to release information. Exile was a theater of calculated perception, a landscape where visibility and invisibility coexisted. The hum of electronics and the distant pulse of the city became both a soundtrack and a measuring tool, guiding movement, awareness, and operational planning. Cliffhanger transition. The Asylum Gambit was not merely about physical sanctuary. It was a complex negotiation of law, diplomacy, and survival. The next chapter would explore the intensification of political pressure, the ethical dilemmas faced by both governments and journalists, and the moment when Snowden's global visibility collided with the personal consequences of exposure. The tension between revelation and pursuit would reach a critical threshold, forcing decisions that would resonate far beyond the immediate moment. The world trembled in quiet pulses, subtle yet relentless, as the shockwaves from Edward Snowden's disclosures reverberated across governments, corporations, and citizens alike. From the halls of Washington to the streets of Berlin, from tech headquarters in Silicon Valley to crowded apartments in Buenos Aires, the revelation of PRISM and associated surveillance programs unsettled the very foundation of trust in digital life. What had once been invisible, abstract, and theoretical now stood fully exposed. The infrastructure, the methods, the scale, and the human consequence of global surveillance. Snowden's presence in exile was both focal point and catalyst. His careful orchestration of asylum, media strategy, and continued disclosures had converted him from mere whistleblower to living symbol of the tension between privacy and state power. Governments responded with fury, urgency, and precision. Task forces mobilized, cryptographers analyzed metadata, counterintelligence officers traced international travel, and diplomatic pressure layered across continents. Each nation engaged in its own calculus, some eager to exploit the disruption for political gain, others wrestling with the ethical dilemmas of harboring a figure who had both illuminated and destabilized global systems. The media frenzy reached a scale and intensity that defied precedent. Headlines labeled Snowden as hero, traitor, visionary, criminal. Op-eds dissected both morality and legality. Social media became a sprawling agora of debate, accusation, and speculation. In real time, ordinary citizens attempted to digest the implications that their emails, phone calls, search histories, and online movements had been collected, analyzed, and stored without their knowledge or consent. Snowden's files were not static. They had become an agent of change, a mirror reflecting the capabilities of the modern state, and a provocation that demanded public scrutiny, debate, and action. Within this torrent, Snowden maintained meticulous control. Safe houses, encrypted communications, and carefully timed disclosures were combined with an acute awareness of psychological, political, and operational pressures. Footsteps in hallways, the faint clatter of doors, distant vehicle engines, all became part of a mental map, a sensory network that informed both immediate decisions and long-term strategy. Each movement was deliberate, each interaction measured, each release of information calibrated to maximize impact without compromising security. Diplomatic tensions intensified dramatically. Nations debated asylum, extradition, and the legal ramifications of Snowden's presence. International law, previously an abstract framework, became a living battlefield where precedent, treaty obligations, and public perception collided. Some states saw opportunity, others risk. Some leveraged the moment to pressure rivals, while others sought to establish moral authority by emphasizing human rights and transparency. Each negotiation, each statement, each leaked report carried global consequence, shaping alliances and antagonisms in a manner that transcended the immediate circumstances of Snowden's flight. The ripple effects were not limited to politics. Technology companies reevaluated data storage, compliance, and security protocols. Engineers, administrators, and executives raced to understand the scope of vulnerability exposed. Encryption, once a specialized concern, became mainstream discussion. Ordinary users awakened to the reality of global monitoring, altered digital habits, sought anonymous communication channels, and engaged in debates about the ethics and legality of surveillance. The files spoke beyond governments. They spoke to a global population, awakening a consciousness that had existed in ignorance and forcing the world to confront uncomfortable truths about privacy, power, and control. Snowden's personal life, already defined by extreme vigilance, became increasingly intertwined with the global consequences of his actions. Each decision he made reverberated outward. A press release timed to influence public opinion, a carefully phrased interview designed to frame debate, a minor movement from one safe location to another executed with full awareness of surveillance. The psychological strain was immense, yet he cultivated routines, sleep-friendly sensory cues, meditation, and observation that allowed him to maintain mental clarity amid relentless operational pressure. The hum of electronics, the soft rustle of papers, distant city noise, and subtle environmental shifts became a consistent, rhythmic background against which he navigated the extraordinary complexity of exile. International intelligence communities intensified efforts to assess, mitigate, and respond to the disclosures. Analysts reconstructed digital pathways, traced network anomalies, and evaluated potential leaks. Counterintelligence officers collaborated across borders, blending human intelligence with advanced analytics. The very technology that Snowden had exposed became a battlefield. Servers, metadata, and encrypted communications were both tools of pursuit and objects of strategic defense. The hunt had evolved into a multidimensional conflict, one in which the physical, digital, and psychological spheres merged seamlessly. The public debate reached a crescendo. Citizens debated civil liberties, state power, and ethical responsibility. Governments were forced to justify surveillance programs, adjust protocols, and engage in public relations campaigns. Media narratives oscillated between condemnation and admiration, while academics, legal experts, and technologists dissected implications with painstaking precision. Snowden had initiated not merely a disclosure, but a global conversation that reshaped societal understanding of privacy, trust, and the limits of power. Amidst the chaos, Snowden's own reflections became increasingly intricate. He considered the human consequences of the revelations, the individuals unknowingly observed, the officials grappling with exposure, and the broader ethical implications of transparency versus secrecy. Every document, every slide, every dataset was both a revelation and a moral instrument, a reflection of societal choices mediated through technology. The files had become living entities, interacting with law, politics, ethics, and human perception, and Snowden, as their steward, bore the weight of responsibility for both impact and safety. Physical movement remained a constant challenge. Safe houses, embassy corridors, and temporary accommodations required meticulous planning. Footsteps outside, distant voices, and subtle changes in the environment were indicators of both safety and potential threat. The choreography of survival, timing, observation, and interaction was a daily discipline, a rhythm as precise as any digital protocol he had once monitored. The ambient sounds of the city, the hum of electricity, and the faint mechanical operations of surveillance devices created an acoustic map of constant awareness. Snowden's media strategy remained crucial. Interviews were carefully orchestrated, press statements calibrated, and disclosures timed to influence discourse while minimizing risk. Each revelation of PRISM data, contextualized and verified, amplified the ongoing global conversation. The files were no longer static. They were instruments of influence, shaping debate, policy, and public consciousness. The interplay between disclosure and survival defined every choice, every interaction, and every movement. The geopolitical landscape was in turmoil. International alliances were strained, domestic political debates intensified, and legal frameworks were tested. Snowden's disclosures had not only exposed operational details, they had catalyzed a systemic reevaluation of surveillance practices, privacy law, and the ethical boundaries of state power. Intelligence agencies recalibrated, corporations fortified, and citizens engaged in unprecedented scrutiny of their digital lives. Every response carried both practical and symbolic weight, a reflection of the global shockwaves set in motion by a single individual acting with foresight, courage, and extraordinary consequence. And yet, in the midst of public attention and global strategy, Snowden remained acutely aware of personal vulnerability. Footsteps, the hum of servers, distant city sounds, and subtle environmental cues were constant reminders that observation was both omnipresent and invisible. Each day, each movement, each interaction was part of a continuous calculus of survival, impact, and ethical responsibility. Exile, media strategy, and operational security were inseparable from the broader consequences of disclosure, forming an intertwined narrative of risk, revelation, and resilience. Cliffhanger transition. The files had spoken, but their resonance was far from over. The final chapter would confront the aftermath, the personal, political, and societal consequences of Snowden's disclosures, the evolution of global surveillance, and the moral, legal, and human questions that would endure long after his flight. The world had been awakened, but the story of accountability, ethics, and transparency was only beginning. The aftermath of revelation settled like a slow tide over the world. Edward Snowden, still in exile, observed the ripples from his hidden vantage points, the quiet streets, the dimly lit rooms, the hum of electronics that had become both companion and sentinel. The files had spoken, and now the world was forced to listen, to respond, and to reckon. Governments had adjusted surveillance protocols, citizens had reconsidered digital habits, and corporations had fortified infrastructures, but the consequences were not merely technical. They were human, ethical, and philosophical, resonating across every layer of society. In the stillness of safe houses, Snowden reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with one man's decision to flip the mirror on the powerful. The quiet hum of computers, the subtle click of encryption devices, and the muted chatter of distant city streets formed a rhythm that was both sleep-friendly and unnervingly precise, echoing the delicate balance he had maintained between exposure and secrecy. He considered each step, the selection of documents, the calculation of risk, the coordination with journalists, and the navigation of international law. Every detail had mattered, every decision had consequences, and every moment had carried the weight of ethical responsibility. Globally, the files sparked an irreversible discourse. Surveillance programs were scrutinized under legal and ethical lenses. Intelligence agencies recalibrated operational norms, and international law was tested against modern realities of data, communication, and digital sovereignty. Citizens became participants in the debate, raising questions that were once confined to government offices, think tanks, and encrypted forums. Privacy had been transformed from abstract principle into tangible urgency, a collective consciousness awakened by the courage and calculated risk of a single individual. Snowden's personal narrative intertwined with these transformations. Each day in exile required discipline. Observation, calculation, and vigilance formed the rhythm of life, alongside intermittent moments of reflection and human connection. The faint echo of footsteps in hallways, the hum of distant traffic, the subtle mechanical vibration of electronic surveillance, all became part of an auditory map that guided movement and ensured survival. Yet, the emotional weight of isolation, scrutiny, and the knowledge of global dependence on his judgment remained profound. Sleep, though patterned and rhythmic, carried the subtle tension of perpetual awareness, each night an exercise in balancing rest with readiness. Public and political reactions evolved. Legislators debated the boundaries of surveillance, judges interpreted constitutional limits, and activists leveraged the disclosures to push for reform. Media outlets documented, contextualized, and dissected the implications, amplifying the impact of the files while shaping perception. Snowden's presence, even from a distant exile, remained central to these processes, a human nexus connecting ethical reflection, technological reality, and political consequence. Footsteps outside safe houses, murmurs in distant hallways, and the low hum of electronics became constant companions, a subtle reminder that even in absence, visibility could not be fully escaped. The ethical reverberations were equally profound. Scholars, journalists, and citizens debated moral responsibility versus legal compliance, transparency versus secrecy, and the tension between individual courage and institutional power. Snowden had not merely exposed mechanisms, he had provoked an enduring conversation about accountability, trust, and the human cost of surveillance. Each document he had released became a touchstone for reflection, a mirror through which societies examined themselves, their institutions, and their digital footprints. In practical terms, the aftermath required constant adaptation. Safe houses were rotated, encrypted channels maintained, and every interaction carefully orchestrated to minimize risk while maximizing impact. The calculus of survival extended beyond immediate safety, incorporating long-term strategy, continued engagement with journalists, selective releases, and careful observation of political, corporate, and social responses. The files, once static, became dynamic instruments of influence, shaping policy, opinion, and ethics globally. International relations were reshaped. Some nations praised his courage, framing him as a whistleblower challenging overreach. Others denounced him as a traitor threatening national security. Diplomatic channels were activated, treaties and agreements reconsidered, and intelligence communities reevaluated operational protocols. Snowden's exile became a fulcrum around which global politics, ethical debate, and technological awareness pivoted. Every decision he made, public or private, visible or unseen, resonated far beyond his immediate surroundings. The files themselves continued to echo, serving as both shield and mirror. Analysts traced metadata, corporations fortified networks, and governments re-examined policy. Citizens debated privacy, technology, and morality with newfound intensity. The disclosures had transcended the digital. They had become cultural, legal, and ethical phenomena. Snowden's actions had catalyzed a multi-dimensional reckoning, a global conversation about the nature of power, secrecy, and accountability. Even in moments of solitude, the weight of consequence was palpable. Footsteps, distant conversations, and environmental cues, once ordinary, were transformed into instruments of awareness, reminders that visibility, risk, and observation were omnipresent. The interplay between exposure and discretion formed a rhythm, both sleep-friendly and tension-laden, guiding thought, action, and reflection. Snowden's careful choreography of survival, disclosure, and impact continued to define each day, shaping both personal experience and global consequence. Yet, for all the global impact, the human story remained central. Snowden's exile, personal sacrifices, and relentless vigilance illustrated the cost of transparency in a world governed by secrecy and control. Each decision carried ethical, legal, and emotional weight. The files had spoken, but the human behind them bore responsibility not only for revelation, but also for the ongoing consequences that echoed across societies, institutions, and daily life. Subtle teaser to next topic. And while Snowden's disclosures reshaped the digital world, the interplay of secrecy, power, and public fascination is not confined to modern intelligence alone. History is punctuated by figures whose private lives, hidden networks, and unresolved mysteries captivate the world long after their final moments. The next exploration will journey into the shadowed corridors of Hollywood whispers, declassified files, and one of the most enduring enigmas of the 20th century, Marilyn Monroe, the files, the final night, and the secrets that linger in the space between myth and truth.